She stood in front of an entire town that looked at her like she was nothing. Every man turned away, every whisper cut deeper than a blade. Then one stranger walked toward her. And what happened next changed the entire frontier forever. If you've ever been counted out, overlooked, or told you weren't enough, this story is for you. Stay until the very end. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far the story travels. 1. The morning they lined the women up in Red Hollow's town square, the sky was the color of old bone, pale, cold, and offering nothing. It was the kind of February sky that didn't pretend. No warmth hiding behind the clouds. No suggestion that spring was coming any time soon. Just flat, grey light pressing down on the rooftops of a frontier town that had been scraped out of hard earth by harder people, most of whom had stopped expecting much from either the land or the weather a long time ago. Mara Whitlock stood at the far end of the row. She hadn't planned on being lost. She hadn't planned on being here at all if she was honest with herself. And honesty was one of the few things she'd managed to keep through the wreckage of the past several years. She'd come to Red Hollow with a worn leather satchel, a toolbox that weighed more than some children, and the kind of quietness that settles into a person when they've learned that speaking up doesn't always help. She was 34 years old. In frontier terms, that was late. In human terms, it was nothing. But standing in that row, beside women who were younger, softer-faced, and less visibly tired, 34 felt like something she was being asked to apologize for. She didn't apologize. She stood straight, hands clasped in front of her, and watched the men work their way down the line. There were 10 women. There were 10 settlers. That was how these arrangements worked, organized by the Town Settlement Committee, presided over by Reverend Aldous Pratt, who had the face of a man who believed deeply in the goodness of people so long as they met a certain standard of it. The women had traveled, some from as far as 3 states east. The settlers were local, men who'd built claims and needed partners to help hold them. It was practical. Mara understood practical. What she hadn't fully accounted for was how practical could still manage to be humiliating. The first man, tall, square-jawed, smelling faintly of pine resin, walked the line slowly, the way a buyer walks a stable. He paused at each woman, said something quiet, received a response, moved on. When he reached Mara, he looked at her for approximately 3 seconds, then continued walking. The second man did the same. The third didn't even fully stop. Mara kept her face still. She had practiced at keeping her face still. It was a skill she developed somewhere around the time she was 22, and had started to understand that the world was watching her for any sign of weakness it could use. By the 5th man, a ripple had started moving through the crowd. She could feel it before she could hear it, the slight shift of bodies, the way a few women from the town, not the ones in the line, the ones watching from the edges, leaned toward each other. The particular quality of silence that precedes someone saying something cruel loud enough to be heard. She heard it from a woman in a green coat standing near the dry goods store, older than she looks probably. Then from a man she didn't know. Mercer's boy could have done better for himself even. She didn't look toward the voices. Looking gave them something. She kept her eyes forward and her shoulders level and thought about her father's workshop, the smell of leather and linseed oil, the particular rhythm of an awl working through hide, the way her father used to hum something tuneless when he was thinking. By the time the 8th man had passed her and chosen the woman 2 spots to her left, the ripple had become a current. A few people in the crowd were openly watching now. Not the settlers, not the women. Just Mara, the one left. The 9th man had paired off within the first 10 minutes of the ceremony. The 10th had walked straight to the youngest woman in the row. She couldn't have been more than 20, and offered his arm before he'd looked at anyone else. That left Mara, standing alone, at the end of a line that no longer had a line. Reverend Pratt cleared his throat at the front of the square, shuffling the papers in his hands with the controlled discomfort of a man who had not planned for this particular outcome and was now trying to determine whether it was a logistical problem or a theological one? Well, he said, and then stopped, because there was nothing easy to follow that with. The crowd had gone very quiet in the way crowds go quiet when they're all thinking the same thing, but no one wants to be the first to say it outright. The women who'd been paired off were already stepping away from the square with their chosen men, and there was something in the careful avoidance of their glances, the way none of them quite looked at Mara, that was almost worse than the open stairs, almost, because the open stairs were still there. A child somewhere to her left said, "Mama, why is that lady still standing there?" And his mother shushed him with the kind of urgency that meant she'd been thinking the exact same question. Mara breathed in through her nose, out through her mouth. She thought about the walk back to the boarding house, about whether Mrs. Calloway would refund a partial week, about where the next town with work was, and how long the road to get there would take on the money she had left. She was already calculating. That was what you did when you'd been in enough difficult rooms. You started planning your exit before the door had fully closed. She was 3 steps into planning when she heard boots on the frozen ground, not hurried. Not the quick steps of someone making a dramatic gesture, deliberate even, the way a person walks when they've made a decision and aren't second-guessing it. She turned. He was maybe 40, though the frontier did things to a person's age that made guessing unreliable. Dark hair shot through with early grey. A face that had been weathered in the particular way of men who spent most of their time outdoors and very little time worrying about how they looked. He was not especially tall. He was not especially anything, except that he was walking directly toward her with the kind of focus that made the crowd part slightly without quite knowing why. He stopped in front of her, not too close, maybe 4 feet, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to make clear he wasn't crowding her. "Elias Mercer," he said. "I have a ranch about 9 miles northeast of here. 2 kids. A lot of broken fence and not enough hours in the day." She looked at him. He looked back. "I'm not going to tell you it's a good situation," he said, "because it's not particularly. But it's honest work, and you'd have your own room. And there's no one on that property who's going to make you feel small for doing it." Mara studied his face for the thing she was used to looking for, the angle, the part where the offer turned into something else. She'd learned over years and considerable cost to look for the turn. She didn't find it. "You didn't want to pick anyone in the row," she said. It wasn't an accusation, just an observation. Something shifted in his jaw, not quite a wince. "I didn't come here to pick someone. I came because my neighbor dragged me, said it would do me good to get out of the house." He paused, turned out to be mostly wrong about that. Despite herself, something moved in her chest, not warmth, not yet, but recognition. "Mara Whitlock," she said. "I know." They read the names off at the start. She glanced at the crowd, which was watching them with the barely concealed intensity of people who'd just been handed a much better story than they'd expected. Then she looked back at Elias Mercer. "Your kids," she said. "How old?" "Owen's 12, June 6. "They know you came here today?" Owen knew. "He told me it was a waste of time, a beat. He's not wrong about much, usually." She considered that, considered him, considered the boarding house, the road, the money, and the particular arithmetic of having no better option. And underneath all of that, quieter than the rest, the fact that he hadn't walked away. "I can do leather work," she said. "Boots, saddles, harnesses, stitching, repair, new construction if I have the materials. I'm not decorative, and I'm not soft, and I'm probably not what you were expecting." "I wasn't expecting anything," he said. "That's the point," she breathed out. 9 miles northeast, she said, give or take. "When do we leave?" Something crossed his face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite anything else she had a name for. "I've got the wagon out front, whenever you're ready." She picked up her satchel from the ground beside her feet. She'd set it down when the ceremony started 2 hours ago now, and slung the strap over her shoulder. "Ready," she said. They walked out of the town square without looking back. Behind them, the crowd watched in silence for a long moment. Then the murmuring started up again, low and layered, the sound of a community rearranging its story to accommodate something it hadn't predicted. Mara didn't hear any of it. She was already thinking about the road. 2. The wagon ride to Mercer Ridge took the better part of 2 hours, and they spent most of it in silence. Not uncomfortable silence, or at least not entirely. It was the silence of two strangers who had both decided independently and without discussion that they were not going to perform friendliness for each other's benefit. Elias kept his eyes on the trail. Mara watched the landscape shift from the scrubby edges of town into open country, rolling grassland still locked in February's grip, the yellowed stems of last year's growth poking through a thin crust of old snow. The mountains to the north were visible from here if you knew to look, dark ridges stacked against each other, the peaks indistinct in the grey afternoon light. She looked at them for a while. "What happened to your wife?" she asked when the silence had settled enough that a question didn't feel like an interruption. Elias was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of a man avoiding the question, more the silence of a man who'd answered it before and was deciding which version to give. "Fever," he said. 3 winters ago. It came on fast and she was gone in 6 days. He paused. "June doesn't remember much. Owen remembers everything." Mara nodded. She didn't say she was sorry. She'd been on the receiving end of enough automatic condolences to know they didn't do much for anyone. "My father died 4 years back," she offered. Not as an exchange of grief, more as an acknowledgement that she understood something about loss that wasn't second-hand. Elias glanced at her just briefly. What of? A broken heart, mostly. She said it without irony. He'd spent 30 years building a livelihood and someone took it from him inside of 6 months. Some men can recover from that kind of thing. My father wasn't built that way. The wagon jolted over a frozen rut in the trail, and she gripped the sideboard. "Who took it?" Elias asked. "County assessor. Said my father owed back taxes he didn't owe. By the time we figured out the paperwork had been manipulated, the shop had been sold, and there was nothing to go back to." She looked at the mountains again. The assessor had friends in the right places. That's usually how it works. Elias said nothing. "I'm not telling you this to complain," she said. "I'm telling you because you probably want to know who you've brought onto your property, and that's part of it." "Fair enough," he said. They rode another half-mile before he spoke again. "You said you do leather work." "My father was a cobbler and saddler. I learned in the shop starting when I was maybe 8. By the time I was 16, I was doing repair work on my own." She glanced at him. "Most people, when they find that out, assume I only do the easy work, stitching, patching. What do you actually do?" "Everything. Boot construction from rawhide, custom saddle fitting, harness repair. I've done some bridle work and a few pieces of decorative tooling, but I'm better at functional work than decorative." She paused. "I'm honest about what I'm good at." Elias made a sound that might have been approval, though it was quiet enough she couldn't be certain. "There's plenty of functional work at the ranch," he said. "Half my equipment is held together with things that aren't working the way they should. I'll take a look at it. I'm not asking you to—" "I know. I'm offering." Another silence. Different from the first one somehow. The mountains were closer now. She could make out individual trees on the lower slopes, dark against the snow. "Owen's going to be difficult," Elias said abruptly, like he'd been holding it back and decided he shouldn't. "You said, I mean more difficult than you're probably imagining. He's not a bad kid, he's just—" He stopped, worked something in his jaw. "He loved his mother very much, and he's 12, which means he's got the feelings of a person twice his age and about half the tools to deal with them. And he's going to see me as a replacement. He's going to see you as an attempt at one, which is worse in some ways." Mara thought about that. "I'm not going to try to be his mother." "Good. I'm going to be a person in his house who does her share of the work and doesn't demand anything from him he isn't ready to give." Elias looked at her then, a real look, not the quick glances he'd been allowing himself. She met it. "That's more thought out than I expected," he said. "I've spent 34 years being underestimated," she said. "I've had a lot of time to think." Something in his expression shifted, not pity, which she would have resented, but something that looked closer to recalibration. He returned his eyes to the trail. Neither of them said anything else until the ranch came into view. 3. Mercer Ridge was not what she'd imagined, which meant it was slightly worse. The house itself was solid. She could see that even from a distance. 2 stories of weathered timber, with a covered porch that ran the width of the front, a stone chimney leaking a thin thread of smoke. Someone had taken care with the construction years ago. Someone had put in the work to make something that would last. The years since hadn't been as kind. A length of fence along the western side had partially collapsed and been propped back up with what looked like raw branches. Not a repair, just a delay. One of the outbuildings, a barn or a storage shed, had a roof that sagged on the left side with the patient inevitability of something waiting to fail. The yard between the house and the outbuildings was rutted and mud frozen, strewn with the particular debris of a property where there was too much to do and not enough people to do it. Elias pulled the wagon up in front of the porch and climbed down. Mara climbed down on her own side without waiting. Standing in the yard, she did what she'd learned to do when entering any new space. She catalogued the fence situation, the roof, the state of the porch boards. 2 of them had soft spots she could see from here. The woodpile to the right of the house, which was lower than it should be in February. None of it was unfixable. That was what she held on to. The front door opened. June came out first. 6 years old, dark-haired like her father, wearing a dress that was slightly too short in the hem and wool stockings that had been darned at the knee. She stopped at the edge of the porch and looked at Mara with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to hide curiosity behind politeness. "Are you the lady?" June asked. "I'm a lady," Mara said. "I'm not sure if I'm the specific one you're thinking of." June processed this with appropriate seriousness. "Papa said a lady was coming." "Then probably me, yes." "You've got a big bag." "I've got tools in it." June's eyes went wider. "What kind of tools?" "Leather tools mostly. Awls and needles and thread, and a few knives for cutting." "Can I see?" "June." Elias's voice had the slightly exhausted quality of a man who'd had this particular conversation in one form or another many times before. "It's fine," Mara said. "Maybe later, when we've had time to settle in." She looked up at the porch and found Owen. He'd come out at some point during the exchange with June, she hadn't heard the door, and was standing slightly back from the railing, one shoulder against the porch post, arms crossed. He was tall for 12. He had his mother's coloring, she guessed, lighter than Elias, something softer in the bone structure of his face that hadn't been carved away by weather yet. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from her own mirror once or twice. The look of someone who has already made their decision and is waiting to be proven right about it. She didn't smile at him. She didn't do the thing adults usually did, the too bright friendliness, the performance of cheerfulness designed to win over a reluctant child. She'd always found that approach condescending when it was used on her, and she suspected Owen would find it condescending too. She just looked at him for a moment, the same way he was looking at her. "Owen," she said. "Ma'am," he said. No warmth, no hostility either exactly. Just a word that did its minimum job and nothing more. "You were right," she said. He blinked, fractionally. "About what?" "Your father said you told him today was a waste of time." She picked up her satchel. "You were right about that, more or less. The ceremony was ridiculous. I'd say everyone had a bad morning." She moved toward the porch steps. "I'm hoping the afternoon goes better." She went up the steps and through the front door that June was holding open, with the gravity of someone performing an important function. Behind her, she heard Elias say something to Owen, too quiet to make out. Then Owen's voice, flat, "She's strange," and Elias's response, just before the door closed behind her, "Probably." 18. 4. The inside of the house told her more than the outside had. Someone, Elias, she assumed, kept it clean in the practical way of a person who didn't have much time for it, but understood that not keeping it clean made everything harder. The floors were swept, the dishes stacked. A pot on the iron stove still held the remains of that morning's oatmeal, but there were other things. On the shelf above the fireplace, a woman's hairbrush, a small glass bottle of something, perfume maybe, or rose water, and a folded piece of cloth that looked like it might have been embroidered at some point. Left there, she understood immediately, not forgotten, left. On the back of a chair by the table, a woman's shawl, dark blue wool, draped with the casual presence of something that belonged there. By the door to what she guessed was the main bedroom, a pair of women's boots, small and worn at the heel, sitting side by side in the way boots sit when their owner expects to put them back on. Clara Mercer was everywhere in this house. She wasn't gone. Not the way houses were when someone had died long ago and the space had been reclaimed. She was here in the ongoing tense, the shawl still on the chair, the boots still expecting feet. Mara didn't touch any of it. She stood in the main room and waited until Elias came in. "Your room's upstairs," he said, moving past her toward the stairs. "Second door. It's small. Used to be a storage room, really. I cleared it out and put a bed in there last week." She followed him up. The room was, as promised, small. A narrow bed with a wool blanket, a wooden crate that served as a side table, a single window looking out over the north side of the property, the mountain slopes visible in the far distance, a hook on the back of the door for hanging things. She set her satchel and her toolbox down. "It's fine," she said, and meant it. She'd had worse. Elias stood in the doorway looking like a man who had several things he wanted to say and was having trouble deciding which one to start with. She waited him out. This isn't..." He stopped, tried again. "I want to be straight with you. You were straight with me in the town square. I want to stay straight with you." He looked at the floor, then back at her. "This isn't going to turn into something it isn't. I'm not looking for whatever people look for." He seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the sentence, like he'd started it before he decided where it was going. "A marriage," she said. "I've had a marriage." She understood what he wasn't saying. She understood it well enough not to make him say it. "I'm here to work," she said. "That's what you offered. That's what I accepted." He nodded, and the relief that crossed his face wasn't insulting. She thought she knew the difference between a man who was relieved not to have obligations and a man who was relieved not to have to pretend. This was the second kind. "I'll start in the morning," she said. "I'd like to take a look at the outbuildings and the equipment and make a list of what needs doing first." "You don't need to start immediately." "I know. I want to." He nodded again. "Supper's at 6. June sets the table. I'll be there." He left her to it. She stood in the small room for a moment, looking at the window and the mountains beyond it, and did something she rarely let herself do in new places. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. Just breathed. Not planning, not cataloguing, not preparing for the next thing. For maybe 3 minutes, she let the day be what it had been. Humiliating, and then unexpected, and then complicated in ways she didn't have language for yet, and didn't ask herself to make sense of it. Then she unpacked her tools. Supper was a particular kind of awkward. The food was simple: salt pork and potatoes, bread that Elias had made himself with the competent but joyless quality of a man who baked because he had to. And the conversation had the tentative stop-start rhythm of people trying to find a register that worked for all of them. June had questions. June, it turned out, always had questions. She wanted to know where Mara had come from. 3 states east, she said. Whether she'd been on a train, yes, twice. Whether she'd ever seen the ocean, yes, from a distance. And whether she thought horses were smarter than dogs. She said honestly she thought it depended on the horse and the dog, which June found deeply satisfying as an answer. Owen had nothing. He ate with his eyes on his plate, responding when his father asked him something direct, and otherwise maintaining a studied absence from the conversation that was clearly intentional. He wasn't being rude exactly. He was being a 12-year-old boy who had decided that if he was going to be subjected to this dinner, he was going to be subjected to it on his own terms. Mara didn't try to pull him in. She answered June's questions and occasionally caught Elias's eye across the table when June said something particularly unexpected, and that was enough. After supper, while June was helping Elias with the dishes, an arrangement that appeared to have its own routine, Owen put his plate in the wash basin and moved toward the stairs. He stopped at the bottom of them, didn't turn around. "You left your tools on the porch," he said. She had done no such thing. Her toolbox was in her room where she'd put it, but she waited. He still didn't turn. "There's a saddle in the barn that needs new stitching on the left flank. It's been like that since October." A pause. "My father keeps meaning to get to it." He went up the stairs. She stood in the main room for a moment, listening to June's running commentary about the best way to stack plates, and thought about the saddle. 6. She found it the next morning before anyone else was up. The barn was cold and dark, and smelled of horses and hay, and the particular sweetness of old leather, a smell that lived in her memory more reliably than almost anything else. She lit the small lantern she'd brought from the house and held it up. The saddle was hanging on the fourth peg along the left wall. It was a good saddle, she could see that immediately. Old certainly, but well made in the way of things that were built to last, rather than to look impressive. The leather had been oiled and cared for at some point, though it had been a while, and along the left flank, just as Owen had said, the stitching had separated. A 5-inch run of thread that had given way, leaving the leather to gape slightly. She took it down and brought it to the work area at the back of the barn, a rough bench that someone had clearly used for this purpose before, given the scratches and the residual smell of leather oil embedded in the wood. She opened her toolbox. There was a particular satisfaction to this. The familiar weight of the awl in her hand, the way she knew instinctively which needle for which thread, the way her hands remembered the motion of the work before her mind had fully caught up to the morning. She was 3 inches into the repair when she heard the barn door. Owen stood in the entrance, carrying a bucket, presumably heading for the water trough, and stopped when he saw her. She kept her hands moving, pushing the needle through the second hole. "You found it," he said. "You told me where it was." He came further into the barn, slowly, the way a person moves when they don't want to appear interested. He set the bucket down near the horse stall and stood where he could see the work without being directly beside her. She let him watch. "That was my mother's saddle," he said after a while. She stopped, looked at him. "I know," he said before she could ask. I'm not saying you shouldn't touch it. It needs fixing. He stopped, looked at a point somewhere above her left shoulder. "I just wanted you to know." "Thank you for telling me," she said. She went back to the work. She took more care with the next stitch than she'd taken with the ones before, which had been careful already. She used the thread she'd brought from home, the good stuff, made to hold even in wet conditions. She matched the angle of the existing stitches as closely as she could, picking up the pattern of the original maker. "You're following the original stitch," Owen said. He'd moved a little closer, though he probably hadn't noticed doing it. "It would be wrong not to," she said. "Someone put a lot of work into the saddle. I'm not replacing it. I'm continuing it." He was quiet for a long moment. She heard the horse in the nearest stall shift its weight, heard the creak of the wood. "She used to ride every Sunday," Owen said, "even in winter sometimes, if it wasn't too bad. She said the ranch looked different from horseback. I imagine it does." "I haven't." He stopped. "Nobody's ridden it since." She finished the stitch, pulled the thread tight, examined the seam. Clean, consistent, holding. "That doesn't have to mean anything," she said. "You can keep it hanging on the peg if that's what you want. Or you can ride it when you're ready. Either way, it'll hold." She set the saddle down and began to clean her tools. Owen stood there for another moment. Then he picked up his bucket and went to fill it. He didn't say anything else, but he didn't leave until she did. 7. The first week passed in the way of hard work. It moved slowly while she was in it and disappeared entirely when she looked back. She settled into the rhythms of the ranch the way she'd settled into every difficult situation she'd encountered, not by trying to belong, but by making herself useful in ways that were hard to argue with. The fence along the western pasture was her first project. Elias had looked mildly alarmed when she'd appeared at the broken section with tools and timber, but she'd explained what she intended to do, and he'd helped her do it, and by the end of the second day, it was solid. The porch boards came next, then a cracked trace on the older harness set, which she repaired at the workbench in the barn, while June sat on an overturned bucket nearby and asked questions about everything from how needles were made to whether leather came from mean cows or nice ones. "I think it comes from regular cows," Mara said, pulling the thread through with even pressure. "They probably weren't thinking about being mean or nice." "Were they scared?" Mara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I don't know. I think the people who do it well try to make it quick." June nodded, processing this. "Papa says you should always be quick if something hurts." "That's a good rule." The neighbors started coming by the end of the first week. Not in any organized way, just the natural drift of frontier people who heard something interesting and found a reason to be in the area. A man named Hadley, from the next claim over, came by ostensibly to talk to Elias about shared grazing rights and stayed long enough to notice the repaired fence and ask who'd done it. A woman named Mrs. Breckenridge from the farm 3 miles south arrived with a pie she didn't explain and left with the promise that Mara would take a look at her husband's working boots, which had a sole separating on the right foot. She did. The boots were bad, not just the sole but the stitching along the welt, which had been damped too many times and was beginning to rot. She told Mrs. Breckenridge this, and Mrs. Breckenridge looked at the boots and then at Mara, and said her husband had told her the same thing, and she'd been trying to get him to address it for 3 months. "He'll lose the boot entirely if he doesn't," Mara said, "and a man without a working boot in February is a man who's going to lose days of work." Mrs. Breckenridge pressed her lips together in the expression of a woman who had been saying this exact thing and finding it unheard. "If you could fix it, bring the boots tomorrow and I'll fix them." She paused. "What can you spare for payment? I'm not going to tell you a number if you don't have it." Mrs. Breckenridge mentioned a figure, modest, genuinely modest, and Mara agreed to it, and that was the first transaction conducted on Mercer Ridge that wasn't directly related to the ranch itself. Elias, who had been within earshot, didn't say anything until Mrs. Breckenridge's wagon was out of the yard. "You don't have to give them a deal," he said. "You're worth more than what she's paying." "I know what I'm worth," Mara said, going back toward the barn. "But she's not lying about what she has, and a man with a broken boot in February is a real problem." She stopped at the barn door and turned back. "Besides, I need the practice." He raised an eyebrow. "I haven't had a regular shop in 2 years," she said. "I've done repair work here and there, but you get rusty. I'd rather work for less and work well than charge more and second-guess myself." He looked at her for a moment. "You're unusual," he said, not unpleasantly. "Yes," she agreed. "I've been told." 8. It was at the end of the second week that she first heard the name Judge Hale. She was in town, Red Hollow, the first time she'd been back since the day of the pairing ceremony, picking up a spool of heavy wax thread and a new awl handle from the general store. Elias had offered to come with her. She'd said she was fine on her own, which she was. The town received her differently this time. Not warmly, not exactly, but with the particular quality of attention that places give to people they've revised their opinion of. She'd been in the valley less than 3 weeks, but frontier news travelled efficiently, and she'd apparently become the woman who repaired Hadley's fence and fixed Breckenridge's boots, and was holding Mercer Ridge together in ways people hadn't expected. That was a different story from the woman nobody chose. She was coming out of the general store with her supplies when she heard 2 men talking on the steps of the land office across the street, not arguing, talking in the low, even tones of men who had an arrangement. She wouldn't have thought anything of it, except that one of them, a man in a coat that was noticeably better than anything else in Red Hollow, handed the other a folded paper and said something about the Kellerman property that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. She couldn't hear the specific words, but she knew the shape of it. She knew the shape of it the way you know a smell before you can name it. From the quality of the exchange, the way the man in the good coat kept his body between himself and the street, the way the other man took the paper and put it in his vest without looking at it. In the general store, she'd heard the name Victor Hale mentioned in passing. Something about a ruling he'd handed down in a dispute over water rights. He was a judge, she understood, and a property investor, and a man of significant local influence. She stood on the boardwalk with her supplies and watched the man in the good coat walk back into the land office. She thought about her father. She thought about the county assessor who had handed her father a document and told him not to worry. It was just a formality. She told herself she was imagining things. She wasn't. But she didn't know that yet. Not with certainty, not with the kind of evidence that would allow her to say it out loud. She only had the feeling, cold and specific as a blade, that she had seen this before. She walked back to the wagon. She drove back to Mercer Ridge. She didn't sleep well that night, but that wasn't unusual. She'd had trouble sleeping in new places ever since she was a girl. She told herself it was that. It was almost enough to believe. Outside, the February wind moved through the gaps in the barn's old siding, and somewhere in the dark the horses shifted and settled, and the mountains stood against the night sky the way they'd stood for 10,000 years before Red Hollow existed. And in the land office on Main Street, a man named Victor Hale looked at a map of the valley with the patient, particular attention of someone who knows exactly what he wants and is simply deciding the order in which to take it. Mercer Ridge sat in the upper northwest corner of that map. There was already a mark on it. March came to the valley the way it always did in that part of the country, not as a relief, but as a negotiation. The snow didn't leave so much as it retreated, pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, leaving the north sides white and the ground everywhere else a dark, sucking mud that made every trip between the house and the outbuildings twice as difficult as it needed to be. The creek that ran along the eastern edge of Mercer Ridge thawed, and then refroze, and then thawed again. And the sound of it, that particular rushing, unsteady sound of water that hasn't decided yet what it's going to be, became the background noise of Mara's mornings. She'd been at the ranch 5 weeks when the boots arrived. Not just Mrs. Breckenridge's husband's boots. A whole collection of them, brought by different people at different times. Word having moved through the valley the way word moved in small places, not announced, just absorbed. A rancher named Cord Albright came by on a Tuesday with a pair of work boots so worn at the toe that she could see the shape of his feet through the leather. A woman from the Kellerman farm sent her teenage son with 3 pairs of children's shoes, and a note that said simply, "I heard your fare, D. Kellerman." An older man she didn't recognize rode up one afternoon, set a battered harness down on her porch without a word, and looked at her with the evaluating gaze of someone who'd been burned before and wasn't going to make it easy. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, coming out to meet him. "Everything," he said. "Start there." His name was Walt Greer, she found out later, and he'd been working his claim alone since his son had left for the city 3 years ago and hadn't come back. He'd been patching the harness himself with whatever he had available, wire, cord, a strip of canvas at one point, and the result was something that functioned at about 60% and was probably going to fail at a critical moment. She spent 2 days on it. When she brought it back to him, he held it up and turned it over in his hands, with the slowness of a man who's looking for what you got wrong. After a while, he set it down across his saddle and looked at her. "What do I owe you?" She told him. He paid without argument, which she took as its own kind of compliment. The work piled up gradually, and with it came something she hadn't expected, a slow, grudging form of acceptance that had nothing to do with the pairing ceremony or Elias Mercer or any of the social architecture of Red Hollow. It had to do with the boots, with the harnesses, with the fact that when Mara Whitlock fixed something, it stayed fixed. She wasn't being invited to dinners, she wasn't being welcomed with warmth, but she was being brought things that were broken, and in the particular economy of a frontier valley, that was its own form of trust. Owen watched all of it. He'd stopped making a performance of his distance around the 3rd week, stopped positioning himself at the far end of whatever room she was in, stopped engineering reasons to leave when she arrived. He hadn't replaced that with anything friendly exactly, but there was a different quality to his presence now, more like a person sharing a space and less like a person defending territory. She noticed it without remarking on it. Remarking on it would have ruined it. What she did notice, and couldn't help noticing, was the way he watched her work. He had the same quality of attention she'd seen in certain apprentices her father had taken on over the years. Not eager, not performative, but genuinely observant. The kind of watching that was actually learning, even when the watcher didn't realize it. One afternoon she was at the workbench in the barn, piecing together a new bridle for Cord Albright from materials she'd sourced on her last trip to town, when Owen appeared in the barn doorway with a broken length of leather in his hand. "This came off one of the stall hooks," he said. "It's supposed to hold the latch." She looked at it without stopping what she was doing. "It's too dry. The leather cracked. Bring it here." He came to the bench and held it out. She took it, examined the break, set it aside. "Can you get me the small tin in the top section of the toolbox?" she said. "Brown lid." He found it, handed it to her. She opened it, took a small amount of leather conditioner on a rag, and began working it into the surface of the break. "This won't fix the crack," she said, "but it'll keep it from getting worse until I can cut a proper replacement. See how the leather went white right at the break?" Owen leaned slightly closer. "Yeah. That's what happens when it gets too dry. The fibers lose flexibility. It'll start cracking in more places if you don't condition it regularly." She handed the rag to him. "Work it in against the grain first, then with it." He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. That same fractional hesitation she'd noticed before. The one that meant he wanted to do something, but had to get past the part of himself that didn't want to. Then he took the rag and did what she'd shown him. His technique was slightly too rough at first. She didn't correct him immediately. She waited until he'd gotten a feel for the material, then said, "Ease up a little. You're not trying to push it in, you're trying to let it absorb." He adjusted, looked at the leather. "Better?" "Yes." They worked in silence for a while, him conditioning the leather strap, her continuing with the bridle. The barn smelled the way it always smelled, horses and hay and cold and leather, and outside the wind was doing something complicated with the trees on the north slope. "She used to do this," Owen said without preamble. Mara didn't ask who, she just waited. "She wasn't as good as you," he said, and it came out sounding like something he hadn't planned to say. "She didn't know the technical parts, but she used to come out here and work on stuff anyway. She said it was good for thinking." "It is," Mara said. "She thought about everything too much." He said it the way you say something true about someone you loved, where the accuracy of it is also a kind of tenderness. Papa always said she'd worry herself into knots over things that hadn't happened yet. What did she say to that? Owen almost smiled. Not quite. The expression didn't fully commit, but almost. She said that was better than being surprised. Mara considered that. She sounds like she was smart. She was. He set the strap down on the bench. She would have wanted the saddle fixed. "I know that. He stopped. "You didn't want a stranger doing it. I didn't want anything to change, he said, and the plainness of it, no drama, no performance, just the flat truth of a 12-year-old who'd lost something irreplaceable and was still trying to orient himself in the world it had left behind, was more than she'd expected from him. She kept her hands moving on the bridle. Things change anyway, she said. Doesn't matter what you want. The question is just whether the things you care about stay intact while everything else moves. He didn't say anything. The saddle's intact, she said. What was in it is still in it. She heard him breathe, a longer breath than usual, the kind that meant something was being processed and set down. He picked up the strap and the rag again and went back to conditioning the leather. Neither of them mentioned it after that, but something had moved, like a rock that's been shifted just enough to change where the water goes, and she knew they were on different ground than they'd been before. It was another 3 days before she understood the full scope of what Victor Hale was doing. The information came to her in pieces, the way dangerous things usually do, not as a single revelation, but as an accumulation of small facts that suddenly, in the right light, resolved into a pattern she recognized. It started with the Kellerman woman. Dora Kellerman came by herself this time, not sending her son, and the expression on her face when she climbed down from her wagon was the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is no longer sure they can continue doing it alone. She had papers with her. She spread them on the kitchen table. Elias was out working the south pasture. June was at the neighboring farm for the afternoon. And she spread them out and looked at Mara with frightened eyes. "Tell me what this means," she said. "I've read it 3 times and I can't make it make sense." Mara sat down across from her and read. The document was a lien notice, or something formatted to look like one. It claimed the Kellerman property owed a series of back assessments on land improvements dating back 4 years. Assessments that had apparently not been recorded in any of Dora Kellerman's records because, as the document put it, they had been administered under a supplementary district classification that hadn't required individual notification. Mara read it twice, then a 3rd time. "Have you ever seen this classification before?" she asked. "Never," Dora said. "Ezra, my husband, he went through every piece of paper we've got going back to when we filed the claim. Nothing like it." "Who signed it?" Dora pointed to the bottom of the document. The signature was a judge's. She could read the title clearly. Victor J. Hale, District Presiding Judge and Land Commissioner. The cold thing moved through her again, sharper this time. "When did you receive this?" 2 weeks ago. There was a man at the door, not from around here. He said it was a formality, just a notice, that we had 30 days to respond in writing to the district land office. Dora pressed her hands flat on the table. 30 days, Mara, and if we don't respond correctly, and I don't even know what correctly means, it says here they can begin seizure proceedings. Mara looked at the figure listed as the outstanding amount. It was substantial. Not impossible, but substantial. The kind of figure that would require selling equipment or livestock to cover, which would then compromise the farm's ability to function, which would then create further debt, which was, of course, the point. She had seen this before. She had seen this in her father's hands almost a decade ago. The same type of language, the same structure of a claim that was just plausible enough to require expensive rebuttal. The same 30-day window that was meant to look reasonable while actually being designed to expire before anyone could mount a proper response. "Is this the only one?" she asked. "In the valley, I mean. Do you know of anyone else who's received something like this?" Dora's face told her the answer before her mouth did. Hadley got one, and I think the Greers too. Walt Greer mentioned something at the feed store last week, but he wouldn't talk about it directly. 3 ranches. She thought about the man in the good coat outside the land office. She thought about the mark on the upper northwest corner of whatever map Hale was working from. She thought about her father. She folded her hands on the table and looked at Dora Kellerman, a woman maybe 10 years older than her, with soil worked permanently into the creases of her knuckles, and the particular kind of exhausted determination in her eyes that she recognized from her own mirror. And she made a decision. "Don't respond in writing yet," she said. "Not until we know what we're dealing with." Dora frowned. "The 30 days..." 30 days is enough time. Don't respond yet." She stood up. "Can I keep this? I brought it for you to look at. I'm going to look at it more carefully, and I'm going to talk to a few people." She paused. "Have you heard of an attorney in the area? Anyone who does land work?" Dora thought for a moment. "There's a woman in Cedar Falls. That's at Sauls. That's about 40 miles east. Name of Cross, Evelyn Cross. Ezra mentioned her once when we had the water rights dispute with the abbots. He said she was sharp." Mara filed the name carefully. "Go home," she said. "Don't talk to anyone from the land office without me present if you can help it. And tell Ezra to keep copies of everything, deed, original claim, every tax receipt you've ever received." Dora looked at her with the particular look of a person who'd come hoping for reassurance and had instead received something better and more unsettling. Someone who understood what was happening and was going to do something about it. "You know what this is?" Dora said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've seen something like it before," Mara said. She didn't elaborate. Dora didn't push. That evening, after supper, after June had gone to bed, and Owen had retreated upstairs with the book he was currently reading in the deliberate, focused way he approached most things, Mara sat down at the kitchen table across from Elias and put Dora Kellerman's lean notice between them. He read it. He read it the way she had. Slowly, twice, his expression doing the thing it did when he was working something out, which was essentially nothing, a controlled stillness. When he finished, he put it down. "Kellerman," he said, "and Hadley, and probably Greer." He looked at the signature. "Hale. You know him?" "I know of him. He's been in the district 3 years, came from somewhere east. Nobody seems to know exactly where. He's got the judge's seat, and he's got land investment interests, and he's got people in town who don't ask too many questions." He paused. "There are people who think well of him, or say they do." "Have you gotten anything like this?" Elias was quiet for a moment, long enough that she looked at him directly. "Elias." "There was something in December," he said. "Different format. It was about a boundary question on the northeast corner. Some language about an unresolved survey discrepancy from the original land grant. I looked into it and couldn't find anything wrong with my paperwork, so I wrote back saying as much, and I haven't heard since." "Do you still have what they sent you?" "Somewhere." "Find it," she said. He looked at her. I think this is organized," she said. "I think it's been going on longer than people realize, and I think each family has been made to feel like they're the only one dealing with it." She looked at the document between them. "That's how it works. You keep them separate, you keep them scared, and then the 30 days runs out and you move." Elias sat back in his chair. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. Outside, the wind had picked up. "What do you want to do?" he asked. The question surprised her briefly. Not that he'd asked it, but the way he'd asked it. "What do you want to do?" Not "what should we do?" Not "what do you think?" Like she was the one who should be deciding. She realized after a moment that he wasn't being deferential. He was recognizing something. He'd seen in the past 5 weeks the way she worked and the way she thought, and the way she held on to a problem, until she understood it from every angle. He was offering her the space to lead. She breathed in. "First, I find the attorney in Cedar Falls," she said. "Evelyn Cross. I need someone who knows land law and isn't already in Hale's pocket." She touched the edge of the document. "Second, we need to get the affected families talking to each other. All of them, because I guarantee they're not, and that's exactly what Hale is counting on." Elias nodded slowly. "Third," she said, "we need to find out if any of these claims have any legal basis at all, even a thin one. Because if there's anything real here, we need to know before we push back or we'll push in the wrong direction. And if there's nothing real." She looked at the signature at the bottom of the document. "Victor J. Hale." district presiding judge and land commissioner, then we need to understand exactly how far this goes, she said, and find someone with the authority to end it. The wind moved along the eaves of the house. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses made a sound, not distress, just presence. Elias picked up the document and looked at it one more time. My neighbor was wrong, he said, about the ceremony being a waste of time. She looked at him. Bringing you here, he said, setting the paper down again. It wasn't a waste of time. It wasn't the kind of thing that needed a response, and she didn't give it one. But she didn't look away either, and they sat there for a moment in the kitchen's warmth, with the lean notice between them and the February wind outside, both of them knowing that something had shifted in the way things were arranged, and neither of them entirely sure what came next. Mara picked up the document, folded it carefully along its original crease. I'm going to Cedar Falls on Thursday, she said. I'll need the wagon. You'll have it, he said. She went upstairs. She lay in the narrow bed in the small room and looked at the ceiling, and did not sleep for a long time. The mountains were out there somewhere in the dark, the same as always, patient, unchanged, standing the way things stand when they're not in any hurry, because they know what they are and they've already decided to outlast everything else. She thought about her father, about the papers, about 30-day windows and supplementary district classifications, and a man in a good coat who'd handed something to someone on the steps of a land office and walked back inside. She thought about Dora Kellerman's hands flat on the table, Walt Greer's silence at the feed store, Owen's mother's saddle hanging on the fourth peg waiting. She thought, not this time. Then she turned on her side and closed her eyes and waited for morning the way you wait for something you've already decided you're going to face. The road to Cedar Falls was 40 miles of frozen ruts and creek crossings that hadn't fully decided whether they were passable, and Mara made the trip alone on a Thursday morning that started at 4:30 because she'd calculated correctly that she needed to be back before dark. She brought the Kellerman document, the notice Elias had eventually found folded inside a ledger from December, its language different but its architecture the same, and a third one she hadn't known about until Wednesday afternoon, when Walt Greer had appeared at the ranch with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she recognized as the look of a man who'd spent considerable time deciding whether to ask for help, and had arrived at the decision too late for his pride to be comfortable with it. Dora Kellerman told Ezra, who told me you were looking into it, he said, standing on the porch. Come in, she said. He had his document in his coat pocket, folded so many times it had gone soft at the creases. Same structure, same 30-day window, different dollar amount, higher because his property was larger, and a different pretext, something about an unresolved mineral rights classification from the original territorial survey. She laid all three documents side by side on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. Same language in the key passages, same jurisdictional reference to a district commission that, as far as she could determine, had no publicly accessible record. Same signature. How many more are there? She asked Greer. He turned his hat in his hands. I know of 2 others, maybe more. People don't talk about these things. You feel like a fool, getting caught by something you should have seen coming. You didn't get caught, she said. You got targeted. There's a difference. He looked at her for a moment with the evaluating expression she remembered from the first day he'd brought his harness. You're sure about that? I'm sure enough to drive 40 miles on Thursday, she said. She drove 40 miles on Thursday. Evelyn Cross kept her office above the feed merchant on Cedar Falls Main Street, accessible by an exterior staircase that was slick with residual ice and required attention on the way up. The office itself was 2 rooms. A front room with a desk and bookshelves built floor to ceiling on every wall, and a back room whose door was closed and whose purpose Mara didn't ask about. The bookshelves were not decorative. They were the bookshelves of someone who used them. Evelyn Cross was maybe 45, with grey coming into her dark hair, and the kind of posture that suggested she'd spent years in rooms where she had to take up space deliberately or be ignored. She was reading something when Mara came in, and she finished the sentence before she looked up. "You're not from Cedar Falls," she said. "Red Hollow, Mercer Ridge." Mara set the documents on the desk. "I was told you're sharp." Cross looked at the documents, then at Mara. "Who told you that?" "Ezra Kellerman, through his wife." Something shifted in Cross's expression, recognition, and with it a slight tightening around the eyes. She picked up the Kellerman document first and read it, then the others in order, with the concentrated speed of someone who knew what she was looking for. She set them down. "How many properties?" she asked. "5 confirmed, possibly more. All in the Red Hollow Valley? All north of the creek line, Upper Valley?" Cross sat back. "Do you know what the Upper Valley has in common as a geographic area?" Mara thought about the map she'd been building in her head since the night Dora Kellerman had spread papers on her table. Water access. The north tributary runs through most of those properties, and the rail survey from 2 years ago. The proposed line goes through the northern corridor. Cross looked at her steadily. "You've thought about this?" "I've had cause to." "The rail line," Cross said. "If it goes through as proposed, the land values in that corridor will increase substantially, possibly triple, depending on what the company decides to build out." She touched the top document. "And if certain properties have been acquired at distressed prices prior to that announcement, he buys them for nothing after the liens force a sale," Mara said. "And then he's sitting on land worth 3 times what he paid. That's the theory. Is it a good theory?" Cross was quiet for a moment. "It's a theory I've seen work before, not in this district, elsewhere." She picked up the documents again, looking specifically at the jurisdictional language. "This commission he's citing, the Supplementary District Land Commission, I've never encountered it in active use. It exists in the Territorial Code, but it's an obsolete instrument. It was established for a specific purpose in the 1840s and has essentially been dormant since." "Can he use it?" "He can claim to use it. Whether a court would uphold it is a different question. But by the time that question gets answered, the 30 days has expired. The property is in seizure proceedings, and the family has either sold or is buried in legal costs they can't afford." Mara looked at the documents on the desk between them. "My father's situation was different in its details, but this is the same thing. I watched the same mechanism work." "What happened to your father?" "He lost everything, and then he died of it." She said it without drama. It was a fact she'd carried long enough that it didn't need anything extra around it. Cross looked at her for a moment. Something moved in her face. Not pity, which Mara would have noted and set aside, but something more like the expression of a person who has been working a problem alone for a long time and has just encountered someone else who's been working the same problem from the other side. "I have 2 other clients in adjacent districts with similar documents," Cross said. "I've been trying to establish a pattern for 4 months. She paused. "I haven't been able to because each family is isolated. They don't talk to each other. The cases don't connect on the surface." "They'd connect if you put them in the same room," Mara said. "Yes," Cross said, "they would." The 2 women looked at each other across the desk. "What do you need from me?" Mara asked. "Time and access," Cross said. "I need to see the original land grants for each affected property. I need sworn statements from each family about the timeline, when they received the documents, what contact they've had with the land office, whether anyone from Hale's office has approached them about selling." She paused. "And I need someone in that valley who can get those families into a room without it getting back to Hale before I'm ready." "I can do that," Mara said. "It's going to make you a target," Cross said. "It wasn't a warning designed to dissuade. It was information offered plainly." "I already live on land he's marked," Mara said. "I'm already a target." Cross nodded once, the way practical people nod when something has been settled. She began making notes. Mara watched her write and thought about the road back. 40 miles, 6 hours, dark coming in by 5. And thought about how much she had to do before she could call this done. She drove back to Mercer Ridge in the fading afternoon light and said nothing at supper about Cedar Falls because supper was not the time for it and June was at the table. but Elias watched her across the salt pork and potatoes with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he was waiting to understand. And after June was in bed, he came to the kitchen doorway and said, "Well, she's real," Mara said, "and she's been working this longer than us, but she needs the families together." "How many?" "All of them. Every family that's received a document in one place at one time." Elias absorbed that. People are going to be nervous about that. Some of them won't want to be seen as, "I know, I'll go to them myself." She looked at him. "I need to borrow the horse, not the wagon. I need to move faster than the wagon allows." He was quiet for a moment. "You ride?" "My father had a horse." A pause. "I'm not elegant about it, but I'm effective." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Take the bay," he said. "He's not elegant either." She started the following Monday. She rode ranch to ranch through mud and cold, arriving at farmhouses at hours that required explanation and getting invited in anyway, because in the Frontier Valley, someone arriving on horseback in the middle of the week meant something, and you let them in before you asked why. She talked to Ezra Kellerman, who was a careful man and needed the legal framework explained before he'd commit to anything. She talked to Cord Albright, who was angrier than anyone else and needed to be redirected from anger into something usable. She talked to a family named Voss she hadn't known about, two brothers who'd received documents in January and had been trying to scrape together the money to respond without telling anyone, and who looked at her when she laid out the pattern with the particular look of people who've been carrying something in darkness and have just had a light brought into the room. She talked to Walt Greer last, because she'd saved him for last on purpose. He was the one she was least sure about, not because he wasn't honest, but because he was the most self-sufficient of them all, the most likely to decide he'd handle it himself, and the least likely to see why he couldn't. She found him in the barn. He was trying to repair a hinge on one of the stall doors with tools that weren't quite right for the job, and the result was the particular frustration of a person who knows they're doing something wrong and can't figure out how to do it differently. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him for a moment. "The bit's too wide," she said. He stopped, looked at her. "I know that. I've got a narrower one in my kit. I know you don't need it. I'm offering it." She came into the barn and set the bit down on the bench beside him. "I need to talk to you about a meeting." He picked up the bit, looked at it, put it on the hinge. "What kind of meeting?" She told him. All of it. Cross, the pattern, the rail line theory, the plan to get everyone in one place and document the full scope of what Hale had been doing. Greer worked the hinge while she talked, fitting the screw with more precision now that the tool was right. When she finished, he tightened the last screw and swung the stall door twice to check it. "He's got people in town," Greer said. "If a meeting like that happens, he'll know about it within a day." "I know." "So what good does it do if he knows before you're ready?" "The meeting isn't the weapon," she said. "The meeting is what gets us to the weapon. Every family in that room is one more piece of evidence, one more sworn statement, one more document that Cross can use to build a case that doesn't fall apart the first time someone challenges it." Greer looked at the stall door. "And if he moves on one of the properties before you're ready, then we make sure there's a federal witness when he does." She paused. "Cross has a contact at the federal marshal's office, someone who's been watching Hale for different reasons. If we can give him a complete picture, all the families, all the documents, the timeline, he has grounds to move. Without that, it's one rancher's word against a district judge." Greer was quiet for a long time. "My son left because he said there was no future here," he said, not looking at her. "Said the valley was dying, and the only smart thing was to get out." He turned the bit over in his hands. "I stayed because I'm too old to start somewhere else and too stubborn to admit when something might be true." She waited. "But I stayed," he said, "so I might as well make it worth staying for." He looked up at her. "I'll be at your meeting," he said. She rode back to Mercer Ridge in the late afternoon. cold through to the back of her ribs and with mud on her boots that would take a proper cleaning to address. The bay horse was tired and made his feelings about it clear, and she didn't blame him. She was a quarter-mile from the ranch when she saw Owen on the road. He was on foot, unusual for the time of day. He had his coat on and his hands in his pockets, and he was walking with the particular purposeful speed of someone who's not quite running, but considering it. And when he heard the horse, he turned around. His face was wrong, not frightened. Owen didn't go easily to frightened, but something close to it, overlaid with the specific anger of a person who's been frightened and is transmuting it as fast as they can. She pulled the horse up beside him. What happened? Nothing happened, he said. I'm fine. Owen. He looked up at her on the horse, a long moment. Then, 2 men stopped me on the Miller Creek Road. The cold in her chest became something different. What men? I don't know them. They weren't from the valley. He looked away. They asked me if my father had decided to respond to the land notice. I said I didn't know what they meant. They said... He stopped, pressed his mouth together. They said he should think about his family before he decided to make things difficult. She swung down from the horse, landed in the mud beside him. She looked at him. He was 12 years old, and he was holding himself very straight, and his jaw was tight in the way of someone trying not to let their face do what it wanted to do. She did not touch his shoulder. She had learned in 6 weeks that Owen didn't take easily to being touched when he was trying to manage himself. She stood beside him instead, close enough that he wasn't alone in the space. Are you hurt? She asked. No. Did they touch you? No. A pause. They didn't have to. She understood that. The particular violence of a threat delivered to a child was not in what was done. It was in the message it carried, and the message this one carried was precise. We know you have children. We know where they go. We can reach them. The calculation was brutal in its simplicity. Frighten the child and the parents fold. She looked at him for a moment. You did right, she said. Coming home. Not doing anything else. He looked at the ground. I didn't do anything. That was the right thing, she said. Walking away and coming home. That was exactly right. He was quiet. She could see him working with something, the part of him that wanted to have been braver, whatever that would have looked like, wrestling with the part that knew he was 12 and alone on a road with 2 grown men and had come home intact. Let's go, she said. I'll walk the horse back. They walked in silence for a while, the horse's hooves soft in the mud between them. They're trying to scare us, Owen said. He said it the way you test a sentence. Not sure yet if you believe it. Yes. Does it work? She thought about her father, about the county assessor and the papers and the way a man's livelihood could be taken from him piece by piece while he stood there trying to find the legal recourse that wasn't coming. It works on people who are alone, she said. It doesn't work as well when people aren't. Owen walked alongside her. The ranch came into view around the bend, the house, the barn, the repaired fence along the western pasture, smoke coming from the chimney. You're not alone, he said, not to her, or not only to her, more like a thing he was deciding. She looked at him. He was watching the house the same way she'd watched the mountains on that first wagon ride, taking stock of something, measuring it against what he needed it to be. They came into the yard. Elias appeared in the barn doorway, looked at them, at Owen's face, at Mara's expression, and understood immediately that something had happened. He came across the yard with the controlled speed of a father who has learned to move fast without alarming children. Inside, he said, quiet, looking at Owen. Get warm. Owen went. Elias looked at Mara. Hale's men, she said, keeping her voice low. On the Miller Creek Road, 2 of them. They threatened Owen. She watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before. Not quite anger, not quite grief, but something between them that was older than either. He's all right. They didn't touch him. Elias breathed in through his nose, out. He crossed a line, she said, using a child. I know. It changes the timeline. She handed him the horse's lead. We can't wait until Cross has everything arranged. We need to move faster. She met his eyes. And we need to make sure all of it Every piece of evidence, every statement, every document gets into the right hands before he realizes we've been collecting it. Elias held the lead. His knuckles were white against it, though his face was still. He made a mistake, she said. He thought this would break us. Elias looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not trust exactly, because trust had been building since the town square, slow and practical as mortar between stones. This was the moment the mortar set, the moment you stop worrying about whether the thing will hold. Tell me what you need, he said. She took a breath. Everything, she said, starting now. The meeting happened on a Saturday in the Kellerman barn, because the Kellerman barn was the largest in the valley, and because Dora had offered without being asked, and because sometimes the most important decisions get made in the most practical ways. Mara had spent the 3 days prior moving through the valley like water finding the lowest path, not announcing, not organizing in any way that looked like organizing, just visiting, just talking, just making sure that each family understood where they were going on Saturday morning and why it mattered that they come. She told each of them the same thing. Bring your documents, bring your spouse if you have one, bring anyone you trust completely, and don't mention it in town. She didn't know if Hale had informants among the Valley families. She didn't think so. His operation had worked precisely because the families were kept separate, and informants required a kind of ongoing relationship that would have threatened that separation. But she didn't know for certain, and not knowing for certain meant being careful. Evelyn Cross arrived Friday evening and slept in the small room at Mercer Ridge. Mara gave her the bed and took the floor without making an event of it, and they sat up past midnight at the kitchen table going through documents and preparing the questions Cross needed answered in sworn statement form. Cross worked the way Mara worked, thoroughly, without drama, focused on what was useful and uninterested in what wasn't. They got along in the way two people get along when they're both too tired and too focused on the task to waste energy on anything else. The federal contact, Mara said, at some point after 11. Gideon Vale. How solid is he? Cross looked up from the document she was reviewing. Solid enough. He's been building a file on Hale for 8 months. Different jurisdiction, different mechanism, but the same pattern. Land acquisition through legal coercion. He needs a complete picture of the valley operation to move. She paused. He also needs it to come together fast. If Hale gets wind of this before Vale has grounds to act, he'll move the key documents and we'll be back to each family standing alone with a piece of paper. How fast? Vale is in Prescott right now. If I wire him Saturday evening with a full account of what we've gathered, he can be in Red Hollow by Monday at the earliest. She set the document down. The 30-day windows on 3 of the properties expire by the end of next week. If he's not here before then, he'll be here, Mara said. Cross looked at her. You sound certain. I'm not certain of anything. I'm just... She stopped, tried again. I've spent a long time watching things fall apart because the people on the right side of something waited until they were sure. Hale doesn't wait until he's sure. That's the advantage he has. She looked at the document spread between them. So we move when we're ready enough, not when we're certain. Cross considered this. Then she went back to her work. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of March morning that reminds you winter hasn't actually conceded anything yet. The sky was a pale, hard blue. The mud had refrozen overnight, which made the roads better than they'd been all week. Mara rode the bay. Cross came in the Mercer wagon with Elias. June had been left with a neighbor, a woman named Paulson, 3 farms over, who had agreed without explanation because she understood the particular language of a favor asked seriously. Owen had wanted to come. Elias had said no. Owen had looked at Mara. It's not about whether you can handle it, she told him the morning before. It's about what happens if something goes wrong. Your father needs to know you're safe. That's not a small thing. That's the thing that lets him focus. Owen had worked his jaw. What could go wrong? Probably nothing, but if Hale has eyes somewhere we haven't accounted for and he sends men to the ranch while we're gone, I'm not going to be scared off my own property again, Owen said, and the flatness in his voice was not bravado. It was something more settled than that. She'd looked at him for a moment. Then stay, be here, know where the rifle is, and don't do anything with it unless there's no other choice. She paused. That's not nothing, that's something real. He'd stayed. By 9 in the morning, the Kellerman barn held more people than it had probably held at any point in its existence. 11 families in total. Some she'd visited, some who'd heard through the same informal current that had brought them work boots and harnesses to her door over the past weeks. They stood and sat on every available surface, hay bales, fence rails, overturned buckets, a wagon board someone had pulled out to use as a bench. The smell was hay and cold breath and wood smoke from the small iron stove in the corner that Ezra Kellerman had lit at dawn. People looked at each other with the particular awkwardness of neighbors who have lived in proximity for years and are only now realizing they've been living through the same thing. Evelyn Cross stood at the front with her documents and her ledger, and she spoke in the direct, precise way of someone who understood that frightened people needed information more than they needed reassurance. She laid it out, all of it, the obsolete commission Hale was invoking, the rail line survey and its implications for land value. The timeline of document deliveries that mapped together showed a clear sequence working from the most vulnerable properties toward the larger, more defensible ones. She explained what the 30-day windows meant legally and what happened if they expired and what it would cost each family in legal fees to fight it individually. The room got very quiet when she said the last part. Then it got loud. Not panicked, or not only panicked, angry, mostly in the way of people who have been patient and careful and law-abiding and have just been told that none of that protected them. A man named Briggs said something about riding to the land office directly that Elias quietly talked him out of. Cord Albright, who Mara had pegged from the beginning as the one most likely to want to do something counterproductive, stood up and said that if the law wasn't going to work for them, then maybe they needed to consider what else was available. Mara let him finish. Then she stood up. She hadn't planned a speech. She didn't have one. What she had was the thing she'd been carrying since the first night Dora Kellerman had spread papers on her table, a clear understanding of what had happened and what the only workable path out of it looked like, and the willingness to say it plainly. Cord, she said, if you ride to that land office with anything other than a legal document in your hand, you give him exactly what he needs. He gets to be the victim. He gets to call in men with actual authority, and the story becomes about your behavior, not his. She looked around the room. That's the trap. That's always been the trap. He's counting on someone breaking. Albright's jaw was tight. So what, we just wait? We don't wait, we move. She looked at Cross. Tell them about Vale. Cross explained the federal marshal, who he was, what he'd been building, what he needed from this room to act, the nature of his existing file on Hale, the timeline she was proposing. The room listened. Then a woman Mara didn't know well, a Mrs. Hartley from the southernmost property, who'd been standing in the back with her arms crossed and her face unreadable, said, "What does he need from us exactly?" Sworn statements, Cross said, each family describing the sequence of events from the first contact with Hale's office to now, any correspondence, any visits, she paused, any interactions with Hale's men that felt like intimidation. Several people shifted. Mara watched them. She looked at Owen, who wasn't there, which she was glad of, but whose face she could bring to mind clearly enough. The way he'd looked on the Miller Creek Road, coming home through the mud, jaw tight, trying to outrun the fear he hadn't let himself show. He sent men to a 12-year-old boy on a public road last week, she said, to deliver a message to his father about not making things difficult. She said it without her voice changing, but she watched the room change around the words. That's what we're dealing with. That's what he's willing to do. She looked at Hartley, then at Briggs, then at Cord Albright. Every statement you give Cross is one more piece of evidence that this is not a man operating within the law. Every document you've saved is one more nail. And if he moves before this federal man gets here, Briggs asked. My 30 days is up Thursday. Cross is wiring Vale today, Mara said, and your property is not going to be touched before then. She said it with more certainty than she technically had, and she knew it, and she held the room with it anyway, because the room needed something solid to stand on, and she was willing to be that thing for as long as she needed to be. It took 4 hours. 4 hours of statements taken individually. Cross moving from family to family with her ledger, while Dora Kellerman kept coffee going, and people sat with each other in a barn for the first time in years and talked, not about Hale, not always, but about the valley, about their properties, about the things they'd built and the things that had gone wrong, and the specific texture of trying to hold land in a place that could take everything from you in a bad winter. Mara moved through the room the whole time, not sitting, not holding a coffee cup, just present, answering questions when she could, redirecting when she couldn't, catching the small moments when someone started to look like they were going to decide it was too much, and quietly, specifically, giving them a reason to stay. She was talking to the Voss brothers in the corner, the two who'd been trying to handle it alone since January, when she felt someone standing behind her. She turned. The deputy's name was Marsh. She'd seen him in Red Hollow a few times without knowing his name. A young man, maybe 26, with the uncomfortable look of someone occupying a position he'd thought would be one thing, and had turned out to be another. He'd come in through the side door, which meant he'd been careful about being seen arriving. He was holding his hat. He was not in his deputy's coat. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Miss Whitlock, she said. He flushed slightly. I heard there was a meeting. You're not here officially, she said. It wasn't a question. No. He looked around the room, then back at her. I can't be. He hesitated. There are 2 men from Hale's office in Red Hollow right now. They arrived yesterday. I don't know what they're planning, but they're asking questions about the Valley families. Who's been in contact with who, whether anyone's hired legal counsel. She held very still. How long do we have? I don't know. Maybe they're just watching. Maybe they already know about this. He looked genuinely uncertain. Not a man running a calculation, but a man who'd been sitting with something that felt wrong for long enough that he'd decided to do something about it and was now not entirely sure he'd done the right thing. I can't do much officially. Hale's got authority over my position, but I thought, he stopped. I thought you should know. She thought about him for a moment, the risk he'd taken coming here without his coat, without his official capacity, the particular courage of doing something halfway when halfway was all you had. Thank you, she said. She meant it plainly. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left the way he'd come. She found Cross at the back of the barn and told her about the men in town. Cross listened with her pen still in her hand and then said, We need to wire Vale today. Now, not this evening. The telegraph office closes at noon on Saturday. Cross looked at the clock on the Kellerman wall. It was 11:17. Go, Mara said. Cross went, gathering her completed statements into a case with the controlled speed of someone who's been in situations that required quick exits before, and Elias drove her toward town in the wagon at a pace that made the frozen road rattle. The room had noticed the shift in atmosphere. People were moving, gathering their things, the particular tension of people who'd been in one place too long and could feel something coming. Mara stood in the center of the barn and looked at the people around her. 11 families, 40-some individuals, people who'd been frightened and divided and were still frightened but were no longer divided, and said, loud enough to carry without shouting, Go home. Normally, don't rush, don't change your routine. Act like this morning was nothing unusual. She paused. Keep your documents somewhere safe, not the obvious places. She looked at Cord Albright. And nobody does anything that hands him a story to tell. We clear? Albright held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, like something being put to rest. They filed out. The wagon carrying Cross made it to the telegraph office at 11:41. The wire went to Prescott at 11:53. Gideon Vale's reply came back before 2 o'clock that afternoon. Terse, the way wires are when the sender is in a hurry. Documents received, arriving Monday. Secure original deeds if possible. G. Vale, Federal Marshal. Mara read it standing in the telegraph office doorway with the paper in her hand and the cold coming in from outside, and thought about the mark on the upper northwest corner of Victor Hale's map. He'd had his plan for longer than she'd been in the valley. He'd had his people in place, his instruments, his 30-day windows designed to expire before anyone could properly respond. What he hadn't planned for was someone who'd seen it before. That evening, back at Mercer Ridge, she sat on the porch steps in the cold because the house felt too small for the amount of thinking she needed to do. The sun was down, and the mountains were dark shapes against the sky that had gone from blue to violet to a deep, flat black while she sat there. She heard the door behind her, then footsteps. Elias sat down on the step beside her, not close but not far. They were quiet for a while. "Cross thinks it'll hold," he said. "The statements, the documents. Cross thinks it'll hold if Vale gets here before Briggs's 30 days expires, and before Hale realizes what we've put together. That's a lot of conditions." "Yes." He was quiet again. Then, "You know what I keep thinking about?" She waited. "That day in the town square," he said. "I almost didn't go. Owen said it was a waste of time. I thought he was probably right." He looked out at the dark yard. "I sat at the breakfast table that morning and thought about what possible reason I had to go stand in a public ceremony for something I didn't even want." He paused. "I went because it felt wrong to stay home. That was the whole reason." She thought about her own mourning, the boarding house, the calculation of money, the road she'd been planning in her head before he'd crossed the square. "I was already deciding where to go next," she said, "when you walked over." "Where were you going?" She considered. "I don't know, somewhere with work." She looked at the darkness where the mountains were, though she couldn't see them. "I've spent a long time going to places where there's work." He didn't say anything to that. She breathed. The air was sharp and cold and tasted of pine from the north slopes. "Owen told me something this week," she said. "He said he wasn't going to be scared off his own property again." Elias breathed in. "He told me the same thing." "He's going to be all right," she said. "He's harder than he looks." "He looks pretty hard already." "I know." "He's harder than that." Elias looked at her in the dark. She could feel him looking. "When this is over," he started, and then stopped. She waited. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like something it's not exactly," he said. "Or maybe it is what it sounds like, and I'm not sure about that either." She turned her head and looked at him. She couldn't see his expression clearly in the dark, just the shape of him. Solid, uncertain. A man who'd spent 3 years holding himself together with nothing left over for anything else, and was finding, slowly and with considerable discomfort, that there might be something left after all. "You don't have to say it now," she said. "I know." He looked at the yard. "But I wanted you to know there's something to say." She turned back to the mountains. "I know," she said. They sat there until it got too cold to stay outside, and then they went in, and neither of them said anything else about it, and it was the most honest conversation she'd had in longer than she could clearly remember. Inside, Owen was at the table with his book, the lamp turned up enough to read by. He looked up when they came in. "Cold?" he said. "Some," Mara said. He went back to his book. She went upstairs to the small room and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the window and the dark beyond it and thought, Monday. Just hold it together until Monday. Somewhere in Red Hollow, in a room above the land office, a man named Victor Hale was looking at a map of the valley and deciding how to move his pieces. He didn't know that his pieces had already moved without him. He didn't know that 40-some people who'd never been in the same room had spent a Saturday morning in a barn learning that they were not, in fact, alone. He didn't know about the wire to Prescott. He would soon enough, but soon enough was not yet. Gideon Vale arrived on Monday afternoon, not morning. He'd wired ahead from the last relay station to say he'd been delayed. Something about a washed-out bridge on the Prescott Road that had cost him 4 hours and a detour through country that added another 2. He arrived in Red Hollow at 3:30 on a grey, cold afternoon, driving his own horse harder than he probably should have. And he came directly to Mercer Ridge because that was the address Cross had given him, and because a man who spent 8 months building a case against someone doesn't waste time on pleasantries when he's finally close enough to close it. Mara was in the barn when she heard the horse in the yard. She came out with an awl still in her hand and looked at the man climbing down from the saddle. Maybe 50, broad through the shoulders, a face that had the quality of someone who'd seen a great deal and had long since stopped being surprised by most of it. He wore a coat that didn't advertise anything but had the cut of someone who'd been travelling in official capacity for enough years that he'd stopped caring what that looked like. He looked at her, at the awl. "Miss Whitlock?" "Marshall Vale," she said. "You look like you need coffee." "I need to see the documents," he said. "Coffee after." She respected that. They spread everything on the kitchen table. The original lien notices, the sworn statements Cross had taken Saturday, Elias's December notice, the timeline she'd constructed mapping the sequence of deliveries across all 11 families, and a summary Cross had prepared of the legal framework Hale had been exploiting. Vale read through it with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who was not going to miss anything because they were in a hurry. Elias stood by the stove. Owen was upstairs, which was where Mara had asked him to be, and she'd been honest about why. She didn't want him in the room if Vale brought news that required adult decisions to be made in real time. And Owen, to his credit, or perhaps because he understood more than he let on, had agreed without the argument she'd half expected. After 40 minutes, Vale set down the last document and looked at Mara. "The deputy," he said, "Marsh. You said he came to the meeting. Without his coat, not officially. Is he reliable?" She thought about the young man with his hat in his hands coming in through the side door of the Kellerman barn, the specific discomfort of someone doing the right thing too late and knowing it. "He's not brave enough to be reliable under pressure," she said, "but he's honest enough that he came when he didn't have to." Vale made a note. "I'll talk to him separately." He looked back at the documents. "This commission instrument, Cross is right that it's obsolete, but there's a subtler problem. Someone modified the original territorial code record, not drastically, just a small amendment to the dormancy clause, filed about 18 months ago. It's buried, and it's the kind of thing you'd only find if you knew to look." He paused. "I knew to look because I've seen this in 2 other districts." The room was quiet. "He's done this before," Elias said. It wasn't quite a question. "Not with this level of coordination," Vale said. "This is the most complete version of the operation I've encountered. The rail line makes it higher stakes." He looked at Mara. "If the line goes through as surveyed, the land in this corridor is worth roughly 4 times its current assessed value." He was positioned to acquire most of the upper valley before anyone understood what was happening. She thought about Dora Kellerman's hands flat on the table, about Walt Greer turning his hat, about the Voss brothers who'd been trying to handle it alone since January, slowly drowning in paperwork they didn't understand. "What do you need to move on him?" she asked. "What I have here is enough to open formal proceedings," Vale said. "It's enough to freeze the lien actions, all of them immediately, pending federal review. That stops the 30-day clocks." He gathered the documents into his case with the methodical care of someone handling things that matter, but to get a conviction, to make sure he doesn't find a way to surface this in another district 2 years from now, I need the original commission amendment filing. The physical document, not a copy, that'll be in the district land records office. "In Red Hollow," Mara said. "In Red Hollow," Vale confirmed. She looked at Elias. He looked at her. "He has people in that office," she said. "I know. That's why we do it tomorrow morning early, and I bring my own authority." He picked up his case. "I'll need Cross present, and I'd recommend having at least 2 of the affected landowners present as witnesses. People who can be seen publicly standing beside a federal marshal when he walks into that building. It changes the calculation for anyone inside who's thinking about whether to cooperate or make things difficult. I'll have them there, Mara said. Vale stood. 7 in the morning. Before Hale's people are fully organized. 7, she said. He took his coffee after all. She made it while he talked to Elias about the practical details, and he drank it standing up, which she thought was probably just how he lived. And then he rode toward town to find lodging and wire his office. She stood in the yard after he left and breathed the cold air and thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. There were several. She catalogued them honestly, because that was what she did, and then she set them aside, because cataloguing what could go wrong was only useful if there was something you could do about it. And at this point, the variables were mostly out of her control. She'd done what she could do. She'd gathered the people, built the case, found the attorney, made the contact. She'd pushed as hard and as fast as the situation allowed. The rest was going to be what it was going to be. She went back inside and climbed the stairs and knocked on Owen's door. "Come in," he said. He was sitting on his bed with the book closed in his lap, which meant he hadn't been reading. He'd been waiting. She came in and sat on the wooden chair at his desk, the chair he used for his schoolwork, which was scattered across the surface in the organized disorder of someone who'd been interrupted mid-thought. "Vale is going to move tomorrow morning," she said. "He has enough." Owen looked at her. Enough to stop it? Enough to start stopping it. The rest takes time, legal proceeding, courts, the whole machinery of it. But the immediate threat, the liens, the seizures, that gets frozen tomorrow. He absorbed this. And Hale? Hale gets arrested, most likely. Not tomorrow maybe, but soon. She paused. The law is slow, that's frustrating. But it's also what makes it real. He looked at his hands in his lap. "I keep thinking about those men on the road," he said. "I know I handled it right, I know, but I keep going back there and thinking about what I should have said." "There's nothing you should have said," she told him. "There's nothing a 12-year-old boy is supposed to say to 2 grown men who came to scare him. The right answer was to walk away and come home, and that's what you did." "It didn't feel right," he said. "It felt like losing." She considered that for a moment. She'd felt the same thing once, many times actually. The feeling of retreating from something that felt like it deserved to be stood up to. The grinding frustration of choosing the practical response over the satisfying one. "The difference between winning and losing isn't always visible in the moment," she said. "Sometimes it takes months. Sometimes you walk away from something feeling like you lost, and then one day you find out that the walking away was the thing that made everything else possible." She looked at him. "You walking away and coming home gave me information I needed. It told me he was willing to threaten children, which meant we were out of time to be cautious." She paused. "You changed the timeline, Owen. What you did mattered." He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't always know what to do with you," he said, not unkindly, more like something he'd been working out for a while and had decided to say. "I don't always know what to do with me either," she said. Something in his face moved. That almost smile she'd been watching for 2 months, the one that never quite committed. This time it went a little further. Not all the way, but further. "Your mother would have liked you," he said. He said it quietly, looking back down at his hands. "She liked people who were honest about things." The sentence landed in her chest in a place she hadn't expected. She didn't say anything for a moment. She let it sit, the way you let something sit when moving past it too quickly would diminish it. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." "That?" He picked up his book. She understood the gesture. The conversation was done, not because it had gone wrong, but because it had gone as far as it could go for now, and he needed to put it down before it got too heavy to carry. That was something she understood very well. She left him to it. The morning of the arrest, Red Hollow was cold and still, the kind of still that happens when the wind drops and the temperature drops with it, and everything holds its breath. Mara arrived on the bay horse at 6:45. Cross was already there, on foot. standing in front of the land office with her case and her particular quality of composed readiness. Walt Greer had come. She'd sent word the night before, and he'd arrived without comment, which was how he communicated most things. Cord Albright stood beside him, hands in his coat pockets, jaw set, channeling whatever was in him into something that at least looked like stillness. Vol came from the direction of the hotel at 2 minutes to 7. He had 2 men with him she hadn't seen before, federal deputies, she assumed, with the particular bearing of people who do this as a regular function and not as a crisis. He looked at the assembled group. "Ready?" he said. "Since October," Greer said. They went in. What happened in the land office took about 20 minutes and was, like most real confrontations, nothing like what you'd imagine from the outside. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic scene. There was a clerk who went pale when he saw Vale's credentials and decided immediately that his allegiance was to whoever had federal authority. There was a back office whose lock Vale opened with a warrant and a set of keys the clock provided with the speed of a man calculating his future. There was a filing cabinet, third drawer, a folder that Vale extracted and examined with cross, and then set carefully in his case. The commission amendment document, original, filed 18 months ago, bearing on the signature line the same name as every lien notice that had been delivered to every frightened family in the Upper Valley. Victor Hale was at his home, a substantial house on the south end of Red Hollow's Main Street, befitting a man of his position, when Vale and his deputies arrived at 8:15. Mara wasn't there for that part. She'd been told, gently by Vale, that her presence at the arrest itself would complicate things, and she'd agreed because she was capable of recognizing when she was being asked to do the practical thing instead of the satisfying thing. She heard about it later from 3 different people, which meant the account had the natural distortions of word traveling through a small town. What seemed consistent across all 3 versions was this. Hale came to the door in his good coat, saw Vale, and understood immediately. The particular comprehension of a man who had known at some level that a structure built on exploitation was always eventually going to encounter something that didn't move when pushed. He'd known it and had bet, as such men do, that he'd be finished and gone before it arrived. He'd been wrong by about 3 weeks. He said something. The accounts differed on what. One version had him trying to invoke his judicial authority. One version had him saying nothing. The third version, which came from a neighbor across the street who'd been watching from a window, said he simply stepped back inside and returned with his hat and walked out to the waiting horses without being asked twice. Mara heard about it standing outside the general store, where she'd gone to buy a spool of thread she didn't urgently need because she'd needed something to do with her hands while she waited. The woman who told her was Mrs. Breckenridge, of the husband with the bad boots, whom she'd repaired 4 months ago now. Mrs. Breckenridge had heard it from someone who'd been near the land office. She was out of breath from the speed at which the news had moved. "They took him," Breckenridge said, "right out the front door." "I heard," Mara said, though she'd only just heard from Mrs. Breckenridge herself. "People are saying—" She stopped, started again. "The Kellermans, the Greers, all the ones with those notices, they're saying it's going to be reversed, all of it. It takes time, but yes." Mrs. Breckenridge looked at her with an expression Mara hadn't seen directed at herself before, or not often. Not admiration exactly, something more like the look of a person rearranging how they understand the recent past. "You knew," she said. "You knew what it was when nobody else had figured it out." "I'd seen it before," Mara said. "That's all." "That's not all," Mrs. Breckenridge said, firmly enough that it closed the subject. Mara bought her thread and went home. The legal proceedings took the better part of 4 months. She wouldn't romanticize that part, because it wasn't romantic. It was paperwork and court dates and the grinding bureaucratic machinery of a system reversing itself, which it did with the graceless reluctance of something that doesn't like admitting it went wrong. Cross-worked the cases from Cedar Falls, travelling to Red Hollow twice a month, staying in the spare room at the Kellerman farm. Vol appeared at key points and disappeared again in the manner of federal officials who have other jurisdictions and other matters and cannot stay in one valley indefinitely. 3 of the families had come close enough to the edge of financial crisis that they needed help from the others. A loan of equipment, a few weeks of shared labor, the kind of informal mutual support that the valley had been capable of all along and had simply never organized into. The Saturday in the Kellerman barn had done something to the social arrangement of the community that the legal proceedings couldn't undo, even if they'd wanted to. People who'd been neighbors in the technical sense for years were now neighbors in the actual sense. The kind that knew each other's problems and showed up without being asked, not always gracefully. Cord Albright and Walt Greer had a falling out over a shared fence line in June that had nothing to do with Hale and everything to do with 2 stubborn men who'd been too isolated for too long to be good at compromise. Mara mediated it badly, and they resolved it themselves after 3 weeks of not speaking, which was probably how it would have gone regardless of her involvement. The Voss brothers' younger one left the valley in July, took a position in a city 2 states over, sent money back to his brother monthly, didn't come home for Christmas. That was its own quiet grief, unrelated to legal victories. The Kellermans found dry rot in their barn foundation in August and spent the money they'd recovered on repairs instead of the new equipment they'd planned, and Ezra spent 2 weeks angrier about it than the situation probably warranted. And Dora let him be angry because she understood that the anger wasn't really about the barn. That was the valley restored, more or less, not healed. The word implied something cleaner than what was actually true. More like a bone set after a break, functional and real, but carrying the memory of the fracture in the way it ached in certain weather. The courts formally overturned the last of the liens in late October. Mara heard about it not from Cross or Vale, but from Owen, who'd been in town for school supplies and had seen the notice posted on the land office door and had ridden back faster than he usually rode anything. He came into the barn where she was working, a new commission, a full saddle rebuild for Cord Albright, who'd finally admitted his old one was beyond repair, and he stood in the doorway with his coat still on and said, "It's done." She set down the awl. "All of it?" she said. "The posting says all liens associated with the Hale Commission are void, and properties are restored to original claim holders." He came further into the barn. He was almost 13 now, and had grown an inch since February, which she'd noticed and hadn't mentioned because he was the kind of person who didn't like being observed growing. Cross sent a letter too. "It came yesterday, but Papa forgot to give it to you." He held it out. She took it, read it. It confirmed what the posting said and added that Hale had been convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to corrupt public records, and that he had been sentenced and would not be returning to the district or to any position of legal authority. She folded the letter. Owen was watching her. "You thought this might not work," he said, not accusatory, observational, the way he was about most things. "I thought it might not work fast enough," she said. "There's a difference." "But you did it anyway." She looked at him, 12, nearly 13, and he was asking the question that mattered, the one underneath all the others. Not how did you do it, but why did you do it when you weren't sure? "Your grandfather," she said, meaning her own father, "spent his whole life building something. And when someone took it from him, he didn't have anyone who'd seen it before. He didn't have anyone who could tell him what the pattern was." She looked at the saddle on the bench, the leather smooth and waiting to be worked. "I could see the pattern, so I couldn't pretend I didn't." Owen was quiet for a moment. "That's it?" he said. "That's the whole reason?" "That's the whole reason." He seemed to think that was either insufficient or exactly sufficient. She couldn't quite tell which from his expression, and she'd learned that was often true with Owen. He worked things out in his own time and in his own interior, and the conclusions arrived later, sometimes much later, in something he said or did that told you he'd been carrying it the whole time. He went back to the house. She went back to the saddle. The winter came early that year. First snow in October, which was not unusual but was always slightly insulting after the long effort of summer. The mountains went white quickly, the way they did when they meant it, and the valley settled into the particular quiet of a place that has accepted the season. The evening Elias asked her the question. The fire in the main room was almost too much for the small space, and June had fallen asleep on the floor with her head on a folded blanket, the way she did sometimes when she'd exhausted herself so thoroughly that she simply stopped wherever she happened to be. Owen was at the table. Mara had been mending something, not leather for once, just a torn hem on one of June's dresses, and the room had the quality of an ordinary evening, which was what she'd been working toward for most of the year without quite naming it. Elias had been looking at the fire for a while. "Mara," he said. She looked up. He had the expression of a man who'd rehearsed something, and was now discovering that rehearsed things don't work the way you expect when you actually say them. "I've been thinking," he said, and stopped. "I know," she said. She'd known for a while. You couldn't live in close proximity to a person for nearly a year without developing some sense of when they're carrying something. He looked at her. "Do you know what I've been thinking?" "I think so." "Tell me then, because I'm not making a very good job of saying it." Across the table, Owen turned a page of his book without looking up, but she could see from the set of his shoulders that he was listening. She'd expected that to be strange, saying something like this with Owen present, and found that it wasn't. He was part of this, the same as the house and the barn and the fence along the western pasture. You didn't step around him, you included him. "You want to know if this is enough," she said, "this life, this place, whether I'd choose it again if I could choose differently." Elias looked at her steadily. "That's some of it. What's the rest?" he breathed. "Whether you think it could be something more than what we said it was when we started." She set down the mending. She thought about the town square in February, the cold, the crowd, the 3 seconds each man had given her before moving on. She thought about the wagon ride, the silence, the question about his wife, and the honesty of his answer. She thought about 5 months of work, the barn, the saddle, the kitchen table with documents spread across it, the porch steps in the dark. She thought about what it meant to be in a place you hadn't planned to stay, and found that the staying had made something real. She thought about her father, about what he'd built and what it had cost him to lose it, about the fact that the things worth having were always the things that required you to keep showing up for them, even when showing up was hard, even when you weren't sure, even when the ground was uncertain and the outcome wasn't guaranteed. She'd learned that. She'd learned it the hard way, the only way things like that ever get truly learned. "I would choose it again," she said, "all of it." The fire made its small sounds. June breathed on the floor, deeply asleep. Owen turned another page. Elias looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the town square, that first real look, the one that wasn't performing anything, that was just one person seeing another clearly and deciding that what they saw was worth walking toward. "Okay," he said, quiet, certain. "Okay," she said, that was all, it was enough. Spring came again, the way it always did, late and grudging, and then suddenly present, the snow retreating up the mountain slopes and the creek running full and noisy, and the mud returning with its own particular demands. Mara's work had grown into something she hadn't planned when she'd arrived with her toolbox and her satchel and her 34 years of accumulated difficulty. She had a proper workshop now, built against the south wall of the barn, with a real workbench and better light and a small stove for the cold months. People came from beyond the valley now. She'd gotten a reputation, the way you get a reputation when you do good work and don't charge what you can't reasonably defend. June had decided she was going to learn leatherwork, a decision she had arrived at with the total commitment she brought to most of her decisions, and which Mara had begun to teach her the way her own father had taught her, starting with the simplest tools, the most forgiving materials, the work that built the feel of the craft in your hands before it built anything else. Owen had not asked to learn. Owen had simply started appearing in the workshop at certain hours, watching, occasionally asking a question that was always the right question, and Mara had started talking him through what she was doing, the way you talk someone through something, when you know they're ready for it, even if they haven't said so yet. She didn't know what he would do with it, maybe nothing, maybe something. That wasn't hers to decide. Elias fixed the sagging roof on the old storage shed in May, finally, and she helped him because it needed 2 people, and because after nearly a year and a half, she'd stopped thinking of her own labor as a transaction and started thinking of it as a fact. It was what the ranch needed, so she did it, the same way she breathed. The relationship between Mercer Ridge and Red Hollow had changed in ways that were still settling. People who had looked through her in February now stopped to talk. Mrs. Breckenridge had become something close to a friend, or as close as Mara got to that word, which had always been a thing she approached slowly and with a certain wariness she'd been unable to entirely shed. The deputy marsh had quietly provided Cross with additional information in the Hale proceedings, and had survived the political fallout with his position intact, which Cross said was better than she'd expected. Walt Greer had gotten a letter from his son in the city. The son was coming for a visit in July. Greer had told Mara this in the way he told most things, though briefly, looking somewhere other than at her, and she'd said that was good. And he'd said it was something anyway, and that had been enough of a conversation for both of them. The rail survey was confirmed in the summer. The line would run through the northern corridor by the following year, and land values in the upper valley moved accordingly. The families who'd nearly lost everything to Hale's liens found themselves, through no design of their own, holding something worth considerably more than they'd held a year before. There was a particular justice in that which was too obvious to need stating. She thought about her father sometimes. She thought about the county assessor and the papers and the workshop that had been sold before they could stop it, and she thought about the fact that what had been done to her father could not be undone, not by any ruling, not by any restitution, not by anything that had happened in the Red Hollow Valley over the past year. That was true, and she held it true, and she didn't try to make it into something it wasn't. But she also thought about this, that the thing her father had built, the skill, the knowledge, the understanding of leather and work and how to make something hold, had travelled forward in her hands, was still travelling forward, in June's small hands, in Owen's careful watching, in the workbench against the south wall of the barn. Nothing about what she'd done in the valley had reversed what happened to her father, but it had meant that what he'd built hadn't stopped with him, and that was its own kind of continuation, not the same thing, not a replacement, just the next thing the thread passed through. She understood, somewhere in the long work of that second spring, that this was the thing she'd been learning all along. Not how to win, not how to make things right, but how to keep going after the thing you couldn't fix. How to carry what was lost without letting it become the only thing you were. How to find the seam where things had torn and put your hands on it and hold, not because it was easy, not because you were sure it would work, but because the alternative was to let go, and letting go meant accepting that the tearing was the end of the story, and she had never been able to accept that. She was 35 years old in a valley that had learned to say her name with something close to respect, and the mountains were there the same as always, and the work was in her hands, and the small room was no longer small in the way that mattered. She had a home. She had built it the same way she built everything, not from the outside in, but from the seam, stitch by careful stitch, holding what could be held until the holding became the thing itself. In Red Hollow, they remembered her for a long time after, not as the woman no one chose. As the woman who showed up with a toolbox and her father's skill and a history she refused to let become an excuse, and who taught an entire community something it should have known and had forgotten, that the strongest thing in the world is not the person who acts alone. It's the people who finally understand they don't have to.